What's up everybody and welcome to a new video. And in this video we're gonna go over my notes for the source control activity in VS Code. So the first one is that Git support is built in, namely VS Code leverages your machine's Git installation. So therefore you obviously need to install Git first, and you need at least version 2.0. And if you want to use another source control tool, then you can do that via extensions. So for example, if I go here to extensions and then here to this filter, category, and then here SCM providers. So here you can then see a list of available source control management tools. Okay, so that is the first note that I wanted to mention. Okay, so then the next note is about setting up a repo. And here you have two options. You can open an existing repo or you can create a new one. So let's first look at how to open an existing one. Here again you have two options. You can open a local repo or clone a remote. Okay, let's first see how to open a local repo. And therefore I've prepared this Diff Editor here, this Diff Editor folder, and this is version controlled with Git. So let's open that in a new instance. So let's go here to the Explorer, open folder, Diff Editor, select that. And then if I go here to source control, then you can see that source control now is active. So that's how you can open a local repo. Now let's see how to clone a remote. Therefore again, let's open a new instance. And here if I go to the Explorer, there's here also this clone repository button. So if I click that, then you have here these two options. You can provide a URL or clone from GitHub. And let's first first look at the first option here, providing a URL. Therefore I have here prepared one of my repos on GitHub. So here let's simply copy the URL. And then we're gonna paste that into here. So enter, and then let's put it on the desktop. And now it's downloading, so let's open it. So that's the repo, and if I go to source control again, then you can see that source control is active. Okay, so that's how we can clone a repo from GitHub. But now let's look also at this other command. So let's close this repo again, and let's have a look at this clone from GitHub command. So this command, if you select that, then you need to sign into GitHub, and then if you select it, what it does is it lists all your repos. And what you also can do is you can search on GitHub directly within VS Code. So for example, if I search for VS Code, then you can see here's the VS Code repo from Microsoft. Okay, so that's the clone from GitHub command. And so that's how you can open an existing repo. So now let's have a look at how we can create a new repo, i.e. create a repo out of the currently active workspace. And here again, there are two options. You can initialize a repository to create a local repo, or you can publish directly to GitHub to create a remote repo. So let's look at the first option here. Therefore, I have prepared this initial folder here. So let's open that in a new instance. So Explorer, open folder, initial folder. So here then, if I go to source control, then you can see it's currently not active. However, there's this initialize repository button. So let's initialize this workspace as a repository. And here you can see now it's active. And if we look into this initial folder here, then you can see that there now is this .git folder. So that's the first option to create a new repo, namely to initialize a local one. So now let's see how we can create a remote repo by publishing it to GitHub. So therefore, let me delete this folder here again, this .git folder. And now let's open again this initial folder in a new instance. Open folder, desktop, let's go to source control, and here, source control here. And now let's use this publish to GitHub pub, and therefore you obviously also need to be signed in with GitHub. So if I click that, then you can decide if you want to publish it as a private repository or a public one. So let's pick a private. And then here you can select which files should be included. So let's simply include all of them. So now it's publishing. And again, as you can see, source control here is active now. And if I go to GitHub, then you can see that this initial folder now here is available as a repo. Okay, so these are basically the options that you have when it comes to setting up a repo. Okay, so now let's get to the next point, which is about inspecting the commit history. And this is mainly done via the graph view. So to show you how that works, I have prepared here this graph folder. So let's open that in a new instance. So Explorer, open folder, desktop, graph. And here, if I go to source control, then you can see here this graph view, which depicts the commit history. And here, if you hover over a commit, then you get this tooltip, which where you can see then the author of the commit, a timestamp, the commit message, so which includes the title and the body. Then here you can see how many files changed and how many lines were added or deleted in that commit. So in this commit here, there were 2 files changed with 4 insertions. And if I hover over this commit, for example, there's just 1 file that changed. And there were 4 insertions and 1 deletion. And then if there is this point, the point of the branch at that particular commit, then you can also see here the branch. So if I hover over this one here, it's not depicted, but at this one it is depicted because that's where the pointer of the branch currently is. And then lastly, here you have a button to copy the commit ID. So that happens when you hover over a commit. If you click a commit, then that reveals the files that were affected in that commit. So for example, in this one, the readme was changed and program.py. And here then, if you hover over these files, then you have here the option to open that file, and this opens the file in the state that it was in at that particular commit. So at this add print statement commit, the program.py looked like this. And if I go to add function here and open the file here, then you can see the file looked like this. And if you click here the file itself, then that opens a the diff editor for that file. So again, if I click it here, then that's the diff editor. And if you hover over the commit itself, then you also have here this option to open the changes. So this opens then the diffs for all the files at that particular commit. So that's what happens when you click a commit. And another thing that you can do is then to right click a commit. Then you have here these options. So open changes. So that's the one that we've just seen here, open changes. Then you can also check out the detached, create branch, create tag, cherry pick, or copy the commit ID or commit message. And then there's also this toolbar here in the graph view. And the first option that you have here is the so-called history item reference picker. And this simply determines which branches of the repo are shown. So if I click that, then you can see here this drop-down list with these 2 sections here. And the first section we have the option all. So if we select that, then you can see now that it depicts all branches of the repo. And if we select auto, what this does is that it only shows the currently checked out branch. So currently we are on main. That's why it's showing main. And if we switch to dev, then you will see now it only shows dev. Okay, so that are the first 2 options. And then here in the second section, here it simply lists all the available branches. And here you can actually select multiple ones. So let's select both and apply that. Then you can see now here again both branches are depicted. And here, just as a side note, I want to mention that the currently checked out branch is always depicted in blue. So currently we are dev, that's why dev is blue. However, if we go back to main, then you can see now main is depicted in blue. And another side note that I want to mention here is that this drop-down list here is actually searchable. So if I type in A, for example, then it only shows the results that match that. And if I type, for example, main, M, then it only shows main. Okay, so that's the first option that you have here. The second one is then this go to current history item. And this simply highlights the most recent commit of the currently checked out branch. So right now we are on main, and if I click that, then it highlights this add class commit. And if I go to dev and then press this again, then now it shows or highlights update readme, because that's the most recent commit of dev. Okay, so then the next option that you have here is to fetch from all remotes. So you can fetch the changes from the remotes. Then here you can pull the changes from remote. And here you can publish. So let's go to main again and publish that. Let's make it a private repository. And then when we've published it, this will then change into a push command. So now you can see here, this is now push. And then here you have refresh. And then lastly here in this overflow menu, you can switch between view as list or view as tree. And this refers to these files here when you click a commit. However, in this case, it doesn't really make a change because all the files are in the root of the repo. Okay, so now with that, we have covered all the main points that I wanted to cover with respect to the graph view. So now let's go over some side notes. So the first side note is that the graph depicts 3 different branches. However, this is only the case when using here this auto option. So to show you the 3 different branches, let me check out again dev. And then here, let me also publish that. And once it's published, now you can see that here it depicts 3 different branches. It depicts the currently checked out branch, so dev. Then it depicts its upstream branch, which would be then origin dev. And it also depicts the base branch, which is always then origin main. Okay, so that's the first side note, that the graph depicts 3 different branches. And the second one is that similar or additional Git history workflows are available via extensions. So for example, you could use the Git history extension or the Git graph extension. Okay, so now with that, we've covered all the points that I wanted to cover with respect to the graph view. Okay, so then the next point is that alternatively, you could also inspect the commit history via the timeline view of the Explorer. However, in contrast to the graph view, the timeline view only depicts the commit history of a specific file, i.e. it doesn't depict the commit history of a branch or the whole repo. And to show you that, I have prepared here this Diff Editor folder. So let's open that in a new VS Code instance. So let's go to Explorer, open folder, desktop Diff Editor. And here, if I open this diffeditor.py file and then open here the timeline view, then you can see these commits here, these 4 commits. However, if I go to file 1, then you will see that it only shows the initial commit. And that's because file 1 was only affected in the initial commit. Okay, so then the next note is about this tooltip that you see when hovering over a commit. So if you go back to this folder here and then to diffeditor.py, then here if I hover over the initial commit, then you can see this tooltip here. And again, here you see the author of the commit, a timestamp, the commit message with title and body. And then here you see how many lines were added or deleted. So in this case, there were 16 insertions. And for this commit here, there were 2 insertions and 2 deletions. And then here at the bottom, you have a button to open the diffs. However, this opens the diffs for the whole commit and not just for this file here. So if I click that, then you can see here the diffs for the diff editor.py, but also for file 1 and file 2. And then lastly, here again, you also have a button to copy the commit ID. Okay, so then the next node is about the diff editor, which you can open by clicking commit. So let's do that. Therefore, let's click this commit here, add, remove, and modify a line. And here now, let me actually make this window here a little bit bigger so that the diffs are actually depicted next to each other. So here on the right hand side, you have the diff of the clicked commit. So this would be then add, remove, and modify a line. And on the left side, you have the diff of the previous commit. So that would be then this initial commit. And here, just as a side note, both of these diffs here are read-only. So you can't type anything in here. Okay, so then, as you can see here, there are 3 different types of diffs. So if a line was added, then you have this green highlighting here on the right side and this plus sign. And on the left side, you have this shaded area represented with this diagonal lines. And this shaded area represents this additional line here. Then if a line was removed, then you have here on the left side red highlighting and this minus sign. And the shaded area is then here on the right side. And then lastly, if a line was modified, then here on the right side, you have again the green highlighting and this plus sign. And now here additionally, the modified part here is highlighted a little bit brighter. And then on the left side, you have the red highlighting and the minus sign. And again here, the modified part is highlighted a little bit brighter. And then here on the top right corner, we have the toolbar for the diff editor. So the first option that you have here is to open the respective file of that diff. So if I click that, then it opens this diff editor.py file. Then next to that, you have these arrows here with which you can cycle through the different changes. So with that, you can go to the next change, and with that, you can go to the previous change. Then after that, we have this symbol here. And with that, you can show leading and trailing whitespace differences. So to show how that works, let me open the diff for this commit here. And here you can see there is some trailing whitespace. And now if I toggle this off, then you can see this whitespace is not considered as a diff anymore. Okay, so let's turn this back on. And then lastly, here you have this map icon with which you can toggle showing unchanged regions. So if I toggle this on, then now this region here is considered as an unchanged region. And here there are 7 hidden lines, and you can reveal them by clicking this button here, and then you can also hide them again with this button. Alternatively, what you also can do is to simply click those sashes here. So if I click the one at the bottom, then it will reveal a certain number of lines from the bottom. And if I click the top here, then it will reveal a certain number of lines from the top. So that's one thing that you can do. And another thing that you can do is also you can simply drag those sashes. So if I drag here this bottom sash up, then I can reveal individual lines from the bottom. If I drag this top sash down, then I can reveal individual lines from the top. So this is how you can interact with those unchanged regions. And now, just as a side note, I want to mention some settings that you can adjust to change the behavior of these unchanged regions. So therefore, let me open the settings and then put them here to the side. And here simply search for unchanged regions. Then you have here these different settings. So the first one is called context line count, and this controls how many lines are used as context around a change. So for example, currently it's set to 3. And here, if you look at this diff, then you can see here this line was modified. And then here you can see there are 1, 2, 3 lines as context. And the same here at the bottom. This line here was changed, and then we have here 1, 2, 3 lines as context. And if I change this here to 4, then we will see that there's now an additional line of context. And again, if I set it to 5, we get another additional line. Okay, so let's reset that. And then here, let's hide those lines again. And then the next setting is called minimum line count. And this controls how many lines there need to be at a minimum to be considered an unchanged region. So if I set this, for example, to 7, then here nothing changed because there are 7 hidden lines. However, if I set it to 8, then this is not considered an unchanged region anymore. Okay, so again, let's reset that. And then let's hide those lines again. And then here the last setting is called reveal line count. And this controls how many lines are revealed when you click here these sashes. So currently I've set that to 3. So if I click here the sashes, then you can see there are 3 lines revealed. And if I set it to 5, then you can see that 5 lines will be revealed. Okay, so let's set it back to 3. So those are the settings that I want to mention with which you can change the behavior of those unchanged regions. Okay, so now let's go back to the toolbar. Namely, here on the overflow menu, there are these 2 options that I wanted to mention. The first one is this inline view. So if I toggle this on, then VS Code always uses this inline view and doesn't depict the diffs next to each other. And here, just as a side note, if you toggle this off, and then the space here gets at some point too narrow for this side-by-side comparison, VS Code automatically switches to this inline view. And if you don't want that, then you can now go to the overflow menu, and here's this additional option, use inline view when space is limited. So if you toggle this off, then VS Code will nonetheless depict those diffs next to each other, no matter how little space there is. Okay, so let's toggle this on again. And then let's have a look at this other option here, which is show moved code blocks. So to show how that works, let me open the diff for this commit here. And now let's toggle this on. And now, as you can see, you have this highlighting here. So you have these boxes around the code that was moved, and then a line or this arrow between those. And if I put here the cursor into those boxes, then you get this yellow highlighting. And here you also have this button to compare. So what that does is simply moves the respective code blocks next to each other. Okay, so those were the 2 options that I wanted to mention. And with that, now we have covered all the points that I wanted to cover with respect to the Diff Editor. Okay, so then the next point is about the context menu, which you can access by right-clicking a commit. So for example, if I close this Diff Editor here, if I right-click this commit here, then you can see the options. And here, open changes, what that does, it simply opens the Diff Editor. So this is the same behavior that you get when simply clicking a commit. Then next, you have this open commit command, and this opens the diffs for the whole commit. So for all the files, so for Diff Editor Py, file 1 and file 2. And you get the same behavior by simply clicking this button here. Okay, so then next is this select for compare command, and that you can use to compare any 2 commits with each other. So for example, let's compare the initial commit with this white space commit. So right click the initial commit, then select for compare, right click the white space commit and compare with selected. So now this opens the Diff Editor for those 2 commits. So we have our modified lines, but also this trailing white space here. Okay, so that's that commit. And just as a side note, you can actually use that select for compare command with any 2 files. So for example, if you want to compare those 2 files here, then you would right click file 1 and then select for compare, and then right click file 2 and compare with selected. And this way then you can compare those 2 files with each other. Okay, so then the last commands that you have here is to copy the commit ID and commit message. Okay, so now with that, we have covered all the points that I want to cover with respect to the context menu. And then the last point that I want to cover here is the toolbar of the timeline view. Namely, here you have these options here, and the first one is to pin the current timeline. So normally if you switch to another file, then the timeline view updates to show the timeline view of that respective file. However, for example, if I here pin the timeline view of this diff editor.py file, then if I now switch to file 1, then it doesn't update here. Okay, so that's the first option. Then here you can simply refresh the timeline view, and here you have an option to filter the timeline view. So you can filter what time series events should be depicted. So you can here, for example, choose the git history, so that will be the git commits. And then you can also toggle on the local history, i.e. the file saves. So if I toggle this on, then you can see now here we have our git commits and here our file saves. So, and then lastly, here you have this overflow menu. And here there's just this one option called local history find entry to restore. So with that command, you can restore a file from a previous file save. So to show you how that works, let me create a new file. And let's call this test.py. And here, just as a side note, if you created a file with the same name before, then the timeline view actually shows the timeline of that file. So now, to show you how that command works, let me edit some code here. So let's just say print hello, and then let's save that. Here you can see now it created a new file save. And now let's wait a moment, and then let's create a new line. So here simply say print world, and then let's also save that. So now we have again a new file save. So now let's delete this file, and then now let's restore it with this command. So if you click it, then you get this drop down list with different files. So here you can search for that file that you want to restore. So let's simply say test.py, and the one that we are looking for is here the one in the root folder. So let's click that, and then here you have the different file saves that you can restore the file from. So let's select this one here. Then it opens this editor where you can see what the file looked like. And then here with this check mark, you can then restore the file. So now here we have restored the file, and we only have now here this print hello statement. Okay, so now with that, we have covered all the points that I want to cover with respect to the timeline view, and therefore also all the points that I wanted to cover with respect to inspecting the commit history. So with that, we have reached the end of this video, and in the next video, we're gonna go over the remaining nodes of this source control section. So thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.